you do not have empirical justification for a number of core beliefs about the nature of reality that you hold to, but you hold to them in spite of a lack of empirical verification. So you actually are using an inconsistent criterion.
No, I'm not.
Yeah, you are. Do you have a justification that the physical world around you is real rather than illusion?
Yeah, I would say that those are more, those you're talking more about basic beliefs. I believe that's
Wolf,
what
do
you're
you need
referring
me
to.
to repeat the question? Because that wasn't an answer to my question.
I mean, what was the answer to your question?
Do you have empirical verification which would definitively show you that the world around you and your sense perceptions are actually indicative that the world is actually real rather than an illusion?
I would say I don't. Like that's
okay.
like that's
Okay,
like
so you believe the world is real without empirical verification. Is that correct?
well, yeah. I mean, that's just a basic belief.
Is your stated premise that in order not to be skeptical about the existence of something, you need empirical verification? Okay.
You're presupposing that I need evidence for all my beliefs. I don't need evidence for all.
Oh, okay. So could you tell us? Are you arbitrary in your criterion?
DD is bringing up what's known as the problem of the criterion. Let's go through some of the background behind the problem. Let's look at Noah Limos's book, An Introduction to the Theory of Knowledge. In the problem of the criterion, Roderick Chisholm identifies two main questions in the theory of knowledge. A. What do we know? What is the extent of our knowledge? B. How are we to decide whether we know? What are the criteria of knowledge? Chisholm distinguishes between three general approaches to these questions: skepticism, Methodism, and particularism. Let us consider briefly what he says about each. He tells us that we can formulate the skeptical view as, you cannot answer question A until you have answered question B. And you cannot answer question B until you have answered question A. Therefore, you cannot answer either question. Unlike the skeptic, the Methodist assumes that he has an answer to question B, and he then tries to work out an answer to question A. In other words, he begins with a criterion of knowledge, and then uses it to determine the extent of his knowledge. Chisholm takes the empiricism of John Locke and David Hume to be a species of Methodism. The particularist thinks he has an answer to A, and then he tries to work out an answer to B. Chisholm takes G.E. Moore and the 18th century Scottish philosopher Thomas Reid to be particularists. Given the options of skepticism, Methodism, and particularism, Chisholm says, I suggest the third possibility is the most reasonable. Let's clarify what is meant by Methodism by using some examples. 1. Locke and Hume's empiricist criteria. 2. Classical foundationalism. Properly basic beliefs are either self-evident or incorrigible. These two views are widely criticized for being too restrictive. 3. Universal sanction. Properly basic beliefs are beliefs that are pragmatically indispensable for normal life, for example, memory beliefs, belief in the uniformity of nature, belief in the external world, and so on. Now, what is particularism? On particularism, we identify clear examples of knowledge without relying on a criteria such as the one DD is demanding. For example, little children know that they exist, and they know that, without having to know the criteria for knowledge. Here's an ethical analogy: you may know that it's wrong to torture babies, without having to know the criteria for why that's wrong. To recap, on Methodism we are required to know some general criteria before we can know some particular propositions such as, I know that I have hands. By contrast, the particularist says we can know that we have hands without knowing a general criteria. In fact, knowing the general criteria will depend on knowing the particulars, and not the other way around. It seems to me that the particularist is right, because we take little children to know a lot of things, yet they are unable to come up with sophisticated philosophical principles. Craig accepts Plantinga's particularist reformed epistemology. He describes it as follows. Reformed epistemologists like Plantinga don't offer any criterion of proper basicality. Plantinga eschews any search for such a criterion and suggests that if we want to see which beliefs are properly basic, the best we can do is just take an inductive survey of our beliefs, and he insists that the theist will include belief in God among such beliefs, even if unbelievers do not. So, Reformed epistemology is not self-refuting, since it doesn't offer any criterion of which beliefs are properly basic. Let's look at what Craig says about the problem of the criterion, from his book, Philosophical Foundations for a Christian Worldview. In support of particularism, Craig writes, people simply identify clear instances of knowing, without applying any criteria for knowledge or justification. One may reflect on these instances and go on to develop criteria for knowledge consistent with them, and then use these criteria to make judgments in borderline cases of knowledge. But the criteria are justified by their congruence with specific instances of knowledge, not the other way around. The skeptic can raise two basic objections against the particularist. First, particularism allegedly begs the question against the skeptic by simply assuming the point at issue, whether people have knowledge. How does the particularist know that people have this? Is it not possible in the cases cited above, that the particularist is wrong and he only thinks he has knowledge? Particularists respond to this objection in at least four ways. First, regarding begging the question, if the skeptic is an iterative skeptic,
How do you know that? How do you know that? How do you know that?
his question can be ignored because it is not a substantive position or argument. Second, the skeptic tries to force the particularist to be a Methodist by asking the how do you know question, since the skeptic is implying that before one can know, one must have criteria for knowledge. And the skeptic knows he can refute the Methodist. But the particularist will resist the slide into Methodism by reaffirming that he can know some specific item without having to say how he knows it. Third, the particularist argues that just because it is logically possible that he is mistaken in a specific case of knowledge, that does not mean he is mistaken or that he has any good reason to think he is wrong. And until the skeptic can give him good reason for thinking his instances of knowledge fail, the mere logical possibility that he is wrong will not suffice. We are now in a position to understand the dialectic between skeptic and particularist about a second major skeptical objection to particularism. Simply put, the objection is that particularism might easily be abused. One could just go around and assert that he or she knows all kinds of things and sanction this intellectual irresponsibility by claiming to be a particularist. In light of what we have seen above, the particularist response should be clear. Just because it is logically possible to abuse particularism, it does not follow in a particular case that one is actually abusing it. Instead of focusing on generalities and mere logical possibilities, one should look at specific cases of knowledge claims, and require that the skeptic give good reasons for thinking that particularism is being abused in that very case.
Is it self-evident? Do you mean that it is evident to your senses?
No, I mean it's obvious regardless of my senses.
Okay, how are your core beliefs about the nature of reality obvious? How is it obvious that the world around you is actually physically real?
While some properly basic beliefs are self-evident, not all are. For example, it is not self-evident that the external world is real.
So could you tell us, are you arbitrary in your criterion?
My basic beliefs are not arbitrary. They're grounded in experience. There might not be any way to prove such beliefs, but it's perfectly rational to hold them. In fact, you'd have to be crazy to think that the world was created 5 minutes ago. You'd be mad if you really thought you were a brain in a vat. Such beliefs are therefore not merely basic, they're properly basic.
Here's a stronger way to put Craig's idea that you'd have to be crazy to think that you're a brain in a vat. Imagine you were a mad scientist that invented a brain. Now imagine that that brain thought it was a brain in a vat. You would still think that that brain was crazy. There are a variety of skeptical thought experiments, like an evil demon, a brain in a vat, or a matrix, designed to show that we don't know the things we ordinarily think we know, like knowing we have real hands. What these scenarios have in common is that we are faced with an empirically equivalent situation, where we do not in fact have access to the external world. Since we cannot distinguish between the two scenarios, the skeptic argues that we don't have ordinary knowledge.
Well, it's not possible for a believer to say, we could be a brain in the vat, because that would contradict what God says.
There's no way to prove that the external world exists. There's no way to prove you're not a brain in a vat of chemicals.
Did everybody hear that?
To set up the skeptical scenario, which DD says is impossible in his worldview. All we have to do is set up a scenario where some person does not have access to the external world. We are already close to setting up a matrix-like scenario. We can attach a virtual reality set to a baby, such that it never sees the external world. There doesn't seem to be anything impossible about this.
Would the existence and or belief in a creator God be a core belief about the nature of reality?
It's debatable whether belief in God is properly basic. Even if God is responsible for everything in existence, that doesn't mean belief in God is properly basic. That's to conflate ontological basicality with epistemological basicality.
So why do you require empirical justification or justification at all for one ultimate core belief, namely the concept of God, but then when you turn around and in your other core beliefs, such as the reality of the physical world around you, you jettison justification? What is the criterion that would lead you to believe in God? If a particular criterion were to be fulfilled to you, what would that be, and is it non-arbitrary?
I guess if there was some kind of great sign or some grand revelation,
empirical verification.
And I would say similarly, the belief that God exists is, for those who experience Him, a properly basic belief rooted in the experience of God Himself. And in the absence of some overwhelming defeater or objection to belief in God, the believer is perfectly rational to accept that God exists, just as we are perfectly rational to believe in the external world or the reality of the past.
Presumably, Wolf King hasn't experienced God.
Okay, what would be a criterion to believe in the existence of God?
I mean, you had to have some kind of evidence or proof that would demonstrate that it would be actually the case.
Okay, good. So God is a core belief, and in order to believe in God, your criterion in order to believe in that core belief would be some type of demonstrable evidence. Now, do you require demonstrable evidence in order to believe in your other core beliefs? Yes or no?
No.
Okay, good. So you're entirely arbitrary in the things that you believe. How is it the case, and please don't ask me about my worldview, how is it the case that there are absolute, universal, invariant laws of logic? And do you have empirical demonstrability for that? Because that's your criterion for God.
Why ask for experience to believe in God but not other properly basic beliefs like the laws of logic? The laws of logic are known a priori, and no observation would make a difference to that. God, on the other hand, is said to interact causally with the world. Absent defeaters, it is reasonable to believe what is self-evident. If you think about the other properly basic beliefs, such as belief in other minds, the external world, or the uniformity of nature, how would experience provide justification for them? It can't. That seems to be a good reason not to require experience to justify them.
Okay, let me ask you this. Like, you brought up the uniformity of nature. How do you reconcile miracles with the uniformity of nature? How do you do that?
It's not a problem at all. The resolution to the situation is that the laws of nature are never actually violated. The miracles of God are the result of God's upholding all things by the power of his will. We have unseen forces acting upon things that we can see.
What DD is saying here is that God doesn't violate or suspend the laws of nature. Rather, God's miracles are additional forces that work in conjunction with them. This is to misunderstand the problem. Let's look to David Hume to explain the problem. Hume writes, "If there be any suspicion that the course of nature may change, and that the past may be no rule for the future, all experience becomes useless, and can give rise to no inference or conclusion. If God stops the sun without informing us, all of our past experience becomes useless when we incorrectly inferred that the sun would rise."
Do you oppose all circular reasoning?
It's fallacious, yeah.
Okay, good. Then can you explain to me how anything is ultimately justified or verified?
DD, can you explain how circular reasoning can justify or verify anything?
When they say, well, what I'm saying is virtuously circular. I'm using circular reasoning, but it's a virtuous circle, circle, unlike whatever the hell you're doing. Yours is a vicious circle. And to which I want to ask, how does, when the idea of circular reasoning is that the premise and conclusion are the same, in that case, how does saying it twice superior to saying it once? That's a circular argument. Your premise and conclusion are the same. So you're saying God exists, therefore God exists. How is that superior to saying God exists?
Because you keep on saying it until people believe it. That's why.
It's just insertion after insertion.
Circular reasoning is saying it twice. You just said it twice. You didn't really do anything else. So by saying it's virtuous, like it's superior, well, so you said it twice and that's better than saying it once? I'd like to hear why you think that's the case.
Like, how does circular reasoning work in your revelation to God? Like, I mean,
well, you see, I'm going to ask you a question.
No, just answer the question.
How is it? Wait a minute. How is it the case that all circular? How is it the case that all circular reasoning is fallacious? Who determined that?
I mean, it's a logical fallacy. I mean, like if you try to
stop right there. Are there laws of logic that have been violated?
No, just answer the question. How do you get beyond that? Like, how does that work? Does it begin and end with the glory of God, or like what? Like, how does that work?
I don't understand your very vague and non-specific question. How can I answer you that gobbledygook?
Well, I'm asking. I mean, you try. It sounds like you've invoked circular reasoning in your position. I'm just asking, like is there?
Well, wait a minute. Whoa. I'm not opposed to all circular reasoning. I'm opposed. Okay, please don't interrupt me. I'm opposed to some circular reasoning. Now I'm asking you.
DD didn't provide his circular argument. We're still waiting for this mythical circular argument.
Please don't ask me about my worldview. I'm going to ask you a question.